Real stories of werewolves, of Dogman from history, from your emails, illustrated and animated with the democratizing magic of machine learning AI. Welcome to Scary Stories.
How do I help my werewolf friend? Dear Scary Stories NYC, my story goes back to prom night 8 years ago. I've been with my boyfriend since then, but things haven't been normal. I'm gonna call him Bart, but that's not his real name. I need to stay anonymous because I don't want anyone to figure out who I am or who he is. Now, Bart wasn't the type I usually liked. I always went for giant Nordic guys, the kind with blonde hair and blue eyes. My dad used to joke that one guy I dated was practically an albino, but Bart was different. He had thick black bushy hair, thicker blacker bushier eyebrows, dark brown almost black eyes, and a skin tone my mom called swarthy. He was about my height and sort of weird. He dressed in black and always looked a little emo. He had this way of looking at you that felt like he saw right through you. I don't know why, but I was drawn to him. I'd see him in the hallways at school and my heart would start pounding. I could never even get up the nerve to talk to him. I would just freeze and stutter if he even glanced my way. So when Bart asked me to the prom, I wasn't sure he was even serious at first. But he was serious and I was over the moon. My dad got me a $2,000 dress for the event. This gorgeous thing that sparkles. It was the most exciting event in my life up to that point. I felt like a princess, and when Bart showed up to pick me up, my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Prom night was supposed to be the best night of high school. You know, the big dance, dressing up, the whole thing. Bart looked amazing in his suit, like a real pop star. His dark hair was slicked back and he had this perfect smile. We danced, we laughed, and we had a great time. Afterward, we decided to slip out of the venue for some alone time, like teenagers do. There was a small wooded area behind the school. We went there to talk and, make out a little. It was all going fine until Bart started acting strange. He was breathing heavy, and I don't mean in a romantic way. His eyes were kinda wild, and he was sweating a lot. I thought maybe he was just nervous or something, but then he started shaking. I asked him what was wrong, but he didn't answer. He just kind of growled. It wasn't a sound a person makes, you know? I backed off, confused and scared. Before I knew it, Bart dropped to the ground, clutching his chest and screaming. His screams turned into howls, and I watched in horror as his body started changing. And I could hear his bones popping and cracking. His muscles bulged, stretching his skin until it looked like it might tear. I could see fur sprouting all over him, first in patches, then covering him entirely. His face pushed out into a snout. His teeth grew longer and sharper, and his eyes turned a glowing yellowish amber. His hands and feet changed into clawed paws, shredding most of his prom suit. The whole thing took maybe a minute, but it felt like hours. Well, my heart was pounding again, but not like before. This time it was from sheer terror. Bart's perfect pop star looks were being marred, twisted into something monstrous. His eyes, which I had always thought were so handsome, were now these horrible yellow-white orbs that seemed to stare right through me. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My heart was beating out of control, for a completely different reason now. When it was over, he looked at me with those same wild eyes, but they were yellow now, glowing in the dark. He snarled, and then, without warning, he ran off into the woods. I didn't move for a long time, just stared into the trees where he disappeared. Eventually, I went back to the dance, but I didn't tell anyone what happened. How could I? Who would believe me? I just said Bart felt sick and went home. I went home too, and I spent the whole night trying to figure out what I had seen. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning I got a text from Bart. He had woken up in a tree in the woods and had no idea how he got there. He asked what happened and I told him everything. We agreed to meet at a spot in the woods that all the kids knew. A big old tree we called the hanging tree. Nobody knew if anyone had ever been hung on it, but the name stuck. When I got there, Bart was leaning against the tree looking like hell. His clothes were in shreds, and he had scratches all over his body. He was shaking and pale. He kept looking at me with those scared eyes, the same ones from the night before. He didn't remember a thing about what happened after he changed. I told him what I saw, and he just broke down in tears. I didn't know what to do except hold him and tell him it would be okay. That's when I decided I had to help him, no matter what. Bart kept texting me after that, and I would meet him in the woods whenever he needed to talk. He would tell me about blackouts, about waking up in strange places, and feeling like he was losing control of his life. He got a job at Dunkin' Donuts but lost it pretty soon afterward because he could no longer keep regular hours. His condition was ruining his life, but rather than repulse me, it made me even more determined to save him. In my mind, he was the ultimate bad boy reclamation project of all time. Once I fixed him, I thought, I'd have the greatest mate ever. If I could fix him. To support us, I took a job at my father's company even though I hated it. I needed the money to support both Bart and me. I saved up enough to get us a small apartment with a private basement. I thought we could use it to lock Bart in during the full moon and see what would happen. We started by clearing out the basement and building a reinforced room. It was a concrete cell with thick walls and a heavy door. We walled off the pipes and the hot water heater and set up a solid steel door with a sturdy lock on the outside. To test it, we spent a night with Bart in the room while he was still human. He tried everything to get out, pounding on the walls, pushing on the door, even yelling. It held up fine, but we knew the real test would be when he was transformed. The first time we locked him in, I was terrified. I could hear him thrashing about all night, growling and howling. I stayed upstairs where I hoped it was safe, clutching a blanket, afraid he might break out. When morning came, I found the room downstairs a mess, but he was still there, curled up in a corner, back in his human form. He was exhausted and he was confused, but he hadn't gotten out. We had done it, at least for the moment. We started settling into an almost normal life, but the stress was always there. I thought corporate life would be cushy, but the hours were far more demanding than I realized. One month I got stuck in traffic and couldn't get to Bart to lock him into the basement in time. He tried to lock himself in, but it could only be done from the outside. He got out, and he didn't come back that night. Panicked, I called the police to report him missing. They found him the next day wandering distraught and dehydrated, covered in what they later determined was some kind of animal blood. A disheveled photo of Bart even made it to the police blotter in our local newspaper, embarrassing my father and his company. After that, my relationship with my father and my coworkers fell apart. My dad was furious about the police blotter incident. He called me into his office and told me that my personal life was making him look bad. He didn't believe my story about Bart, obviously, and thought I was making excuses for a guy who exhibited bad behavior. I remember him saying, "This is a business, not a charity. Get your life together or find somewhere else to mess it up." That hurt, because I thought my dad would support me no matter what. I was wrong. Then there was the time I tried to explain things to my manager after coming in late because of Bart. I told him Bart was sick, which was not a lie, but when I asked for a more flexible schedule, he just laughed at me. He said, "We all have our personal problems, but you need to keep yours at home." After that, my coworkers started avoiding me, whispering behind my back. It was clear that staying in my dad's company was not going to work, so I took Bart and we left town. It seemed the best idea for everyone. We moved to a new city and rented a little house. I hoped a fresh start would make things easier, but the second place wasn't any better. We had a neighbor who was really nosy. She'd watch us all the time and kept trying to talk to Bart. One night during a full moon, she must have seen him change through the window. The next morning, she came over asking me if we had a big dog or something. She was really scared, but I just played dumb. We had to pack up and leave before she drew attention to our situation. Our next place was a ground floor apartment in a small complex on the outskirts of town. It had easy access to a nearby park, and we thought it would be perfect. But one night, Bart escaped before I could lock him in the basement. He bolted out the door, and I had to chase after him. I ran through the streets, my heart pounding, afraid someone would see him. He headed straight for the park, his transformation starting mid-run. I was terrified someone would be out for a late jog or walking their dog. By the time I caught up to him, he was already half wolf, growling and thrashing through the park's underbrush. I called his name over and over, trying to get through to him, but he was long gone mentally. I went home and tried to sleep, but I was unable. Bart staggered home human again sometime after dawn and collapsed face first into the wooden floor. He bruised his face in the fall, and the bruise lasted for days. I keep reading about the amazing healing powers of werewolves. Will someone tell that to my man, please? He's constantly covered in bruises and scratches. Now, this situation was a close call. In fact, I thought it was too close. We had to move again before the next full moon, and we did. We found another place, this time closer to some woods, hoping the isolation would help. On the first full moon night there, Bart decided he would spend the night in the woods to avoid hurting anyone. I was nervous about it, but I didn't have any better ideas. I waited anxiously at home till dawn, not knowing what was happening out there. In the second month, he encountered a pack of coyotes. They must have sensed something was off about him, because they surrounded him, snarling and snapping. I could hear the commotion from our backyard, and I panicked, running into the woods to find him, trying to follow the horrific sounds of dogs battling each other. When I found Bart that time, he was fully transformed, fending off the coyotes. He was trying to assert dominance, but it was clear he was struggling. The sight was horrifying and fascinating at the same time. Eventually, the coyotes backed off, but it left me shaken and even more fearful of Bart's condition. He, of course, remembered none of this the next day. I think it was the third month we were out there when, despite all our precautions, Bart transformed in a public place, a grocery store parking lot. We had gone out to get supplies and I lost track of time. As the sky darkened and the moon rose, he started to change right there. I saw the signs and I tried to get him into the car, but it was too late. He started changing right there in front of the store. People screamed and ran chaotically in every direction. I had to ask fast, while Bart was still confused, before he finished transforming and gained superhuman strength. I threw a blanket from the back of the car over him, but somehow managed to get him in the back seat while he was still partially himself. I drove off as fast as I could, my heart pounding the whole time, fearing the police would soon be after us. While I was driving on the highway, though, Bart, or the creature he had become, got himself out of the blanket and dove out of the window of my car, which was going 60 miles an hour. In my rear-view mirror, I watched him somersault and then land on his feet, not missing a step, and racing into the woods alongside the highway. I went home and spent another sleepless night, with Bart not coming home till almost noon the next day. The constant moving and financial strain put a lot of pressure on us. It's almost as hard now for me to find a job as it is for poor Bart, and my savings are drying up quickly. Plus, the jobs I can get don't pay like my old corporate job working for Daddy. Bart feels guilty all the time, blaming himself for everything. We have arguments, especially when things go wrong. One time recently, he broke down crying, saying he didn't want to be a burden. I tried to reassure him, but it isn't easy. I was exhausted too from working long hours and managing his condition. But I can't leave him. I love him, and I have to believe there is a way to fix this. We've been trying to settle down in different places, but so far we've mostly just been moving a lot and using up all my savings in the process. I keep hoping I'll find a way to help Bart, but I don't even know where to start. We're running out of money and running out of places to move to. If anyone out there knows a way to cure lycanthropy, please let me know. I'm willing to try anything I can still afford. The place we're living in now has no basement, and Bart is going to have to risk going out to the woods on purpose to spend the night. Neither of us knows what's going to happen next, and we both dread finding out. Can anyone out there please tell me, how do I help my werewolf friend?
I hope you're sitting down because the following is an incredibly important announcement. This remarkably important episode is brought to you by the historically epic tome known in the Western world as Werewolves, Myth, Mystery, and Magic by Katie Boyd. Enter the world of the werewolf, where superstition abounds and shapeshifting is possible. Find out what to do if you or a friend turns into a werewolf or other werbeast. Learn the differences between therianthropy and lycanthropy. Come along for one wild ride, and remember, you too can bark at the moon. If you pick up your copy from the Barnes & Noble link in the description, the channel earns a commission, so you'd be helping us out. And now back to this incredibly important television program, eh? Oh, this isn't television? Well, back to whatever this is, I suppose.
Writers Group Werewolf. Dear Scary Stories NYC. I joined a writers group about 2 years ago. I'm not going to say where because some of them still don't know what happened. I don't want them finding out and thinking I'm nuts. The group used to meet in the basement room of an old local library once a week. It was a mix of people, some old, some young, and most just trying to write that one great book. One guy who I'll call Jay always stood out to me. His stories felt too real, especially the horror ones. They were vivid, full of detail that seemed like they came from experience, not from imagination. Jay was also very noticeable because he always wore this very bright white wristwatch. It was hard to miss, and he never took it off. He said it was a gift from his late mother, and it was the only thing he had left of her. Even during our meetings, he'd always be fiddling with his watch, almost like a nervous habit. I didn't think much of it until Jay started acting weird. Sometimes he'd miss meetings, and when he did show up, he'd look worn out, like he hadn't slept in days. He would mumble to himself or stare off into space. We all noticed, but we tried not to say anything. We figured maybe he was just going through some stuff, or getting deep into his writing. One night after a meeting, I found Jay standing alone in the parking lot, looking up at the full moon. His eyes were strange, almost wild. His white wristwatch glowed in the moonlight. I asked if he was okay, and he just mumbled something about his new story. I didn't think too much of it, I just figured he was being the usual eccentric writer. But things got worse. At what would turn out to be our last meeting, Jay didn't show up. One of the others mentioned seeing him outside late at night, acting really strange. I decided to go check up on him. I had his address from when we carpooled once, so I drove over to his place after the meeting. It was a little house at the edge of town near some woods. The perfect home for a horror author. When I got there, it was dark, and his car was in the driveway. The house looked quiet, but something felt off. I knocked on the door, but there wasn't any answer. I walked around the back, figuring I'd peek in a window and see if he was home. That's when I saw it. Him. Or what used to be him. There was a shadow moving by the edge of the trees. At first I thought it was a big dog, but then it stood up on its hind legs. It was Jay, but he wasn't human anymore. He had changed. His face was more wolf than man, and his hands were claws. He was covered in fur, and his eyes, they were glowing yellow. But even from a distance, I knew it was him. I could see his white wristwatch. It was glowing in the moonlight just like it had in the parking lot. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I stumbled back, and that's when he noticed me. He turned his head, and for a moment I thought he might come after me. But then he just growled and ran off into the woods. I was frozen, standing there, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't sleep that night. All I could do was think about Jay and what I'd seen. I kept running it over in my head, but it didn't make any sense. The next day I jumped on Google and started looking up everything I could about werewolves, but all I found were myths and legends. I didn't know who to talk to or what to do. How do you tell someone that your friend has turned into a monster? I decided I'd better keep an eye on him. The next full moon I parked near his house and I waited. Sure enough, as the sky darkened, I saw Jay come out of his house and head toward the woods. This time I followed him. I stayed far back, not wanting to get too close. It didn't seem like he knew I was there, but I watched him change. It was horrible to watch. He fell to the ground, writhing in pain, as his bones cracked and shifted. His clothes tore, as fur sprouted from his skin. When it was over, he wasn't Jay anymore. For lack of a better term, I'll just say he was a full-on werewolf. But even then, the white wristwatch stayed on his hairy wrist. It was like a beacon telling me that this was still Jay, no matter how much he had changed. He howled and he ran into the woods, and I just stood there, too scared to move. I tried to talk to Jay about it the next day, but he denied everything. He said he had no memory of the night before, and he didn't want to talk about it. He did look scared, though, like he knew something was wrong but didn't want to admit it. I started doing more research, trying to find anything that might help. I found old stories about curses and rituals, but nothing really concrete that I could act on. I even reached out to some paranormal groups online, but they either laughed at me and thought I was making it up, or else they lectured me about the Dogman. This is not the Dogman. This is a werewolf that my friend becomes. I kept trying to keep the meetings going, pretending everything was normal, but without Jay, everyone stopped showing up altogether. I'd see him around town sometimes, looking worse each time. His house was falling apart, and he looked like he hadn't eaten or slept in weeks. I was worried he might hurt himself, or someone else. Then one night, I got a call from another member of the group. She said Jay had called her sounding desperate. He told her he was going away, and didn't know when or if he'd ever be back. She asked me if I knew what was going on, but I couldn't tell her the truth. I just said he was dealing with some personal stuff, and I left it at that. That was the last I heard of Jay. He disappeared and nobody knows where he went. His house was abandoned, and after a while people stopped asking about him. I still think about him, wondering if he's out there somewhere, still struggling with his curse. I keep hoping I'll find a way to help him, but I don't even know where he went to. I just wanted to share this with you because I don't know who else would believe me anyway. Maybe someone out there has answers or can help. All I know is, Jay didn't deserve what happened to him. No one does. Military Veteran Werewolf. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I'm writing to you because I don't know what else to do. I hope you can help or at least understand. My name's not important, and I'm going to call my friend Tom, but that's not his real name. We're both orphans, so we've been like brothers since we served overseas together. We don't really have anyone else, just each other. Tom saved my life more times than I can count, and now it's my turn to save him. Tom and I met in boot camp. We were both just kids, really, with nobody to go back to, so we bonded fast. We started calling each other brother, and it stuck. We went through hell together in places I'd rather not name, doing things that still haunt my dreams. There were nights when I thought I'd never see another sunrise, but Tom was always there for me. He had this instinct for danger, and more than once, he dragged me out of situations where I was sure I would not survive. I will not go into details, those stories are between us and the men we served with. But I owe Tom my life, and now it's my turn to be there for him. We got out of the military and tried to adjust to civilian life, but it wasn't easy. Tom got a job as a night security guard, and I started working construction. We scraped by, but it was tough. I noticed Tom started to act weird after a few months. He'd go missing for a couple of days and come back looking like he hadn't slept or eaten. His clothes would be torn, and he'd have scratches and bruises all over him. I figured he was drinking or fighting, but it didn't add up. Tom wasn't the type to get into brawls. One night I followed him when he disappeared. He walked clear out of town and headed for the woods on the outskirts. It was a full moon, and I was worried he might do something stupid. I kept my distance, trying to stay out of his sight. Tom went deep into the woods, moving fast, like he knew exactly where he was going. He stopped in a clearing and just stood there, looking up at the moon. I was about to call out to him when he started shaking. His whole body convulsed, and he fell to the ground screaming. I watched in horror as his bones started to twist and reshape. His muscles bulged, stretching his skin until it looked like it might tear. Fur sprouted from his skin, first in patches, then covering him entirely. His face grew out into a snout, with his teeth growing longer and his eyes turning yellow. His hands and feet changed into clawed, hand-like paws, and his clothes tore apart. The whole transformation took maybe a minute or 2 or 3, but it felt like 2 or 3 or 4 hours. When it was over, my friend was a werewolf. Massive, terrifying, nothing like the brother I knew. He threw his head back and let out a howl that echoed through the woods. I was too scared to move. Tom, or what used to be Tom, started sniffing the air, and I realized if he didn't smell me yet, he was about to smell me in a second or two. Sure enough, he turned in my direction, his glowing eyes locking onto mine. Man, I didn't know what to do. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I had my old service knife with me, but what good would that do against a monster like this? Just as he started moving toward me, something in his eyes changed. He hesitated. Maybe he recognized me. It was only for a second, but it was enough. The creature turned and bolted into the trees, disappearing into the night and allowing me to live another day. Well, I couldn't sleep that night. I just sat on my porch with a shotgun across my lap, waiting for him to come back. When the sun finally came up the next morning, I went looking for him. I found him near the clearing, curled up on the ground, nearly naked, covered in blood and mud. He was human again, but he looked worse than ever. I wrapped him in my jacket and I brought him home. Well, I got him to his bed, and when he later woke up, he claimed he didn't remember anything. I told him what I had seen, and he just stared at me, eyes wide with fear. He didn't want to believe it, but he couldn't deny it. We spent hours talking, trying to figure out what to do. Tom was scared that he had hurt someone, and I was scared I wouldn't be able to stop him. We started planning. Tom's condition seemed to be tied to the full moon, so we marked the dates on the calendar. When the moon was full, we would go deep into the woods away from people, and he'd stay there until it was over, which sometimes meant 3 or 4 days. I would camp nearby, keeping watch, ready to intervene if he got too close to town. Well, the first time we tried this, I was very confident going in, but it didn't go well. We set up camp about 5 miles into the forest. Tom was nervous, pacing around, checking his watch every few minutes. As the moon rose, he started to change. I built myself a tree blind and I watched up in the tree from a distance, the same horror gripping me as before. His screams turned into growls, and then he was the werewolf again. He roamed the woods, sniffing and snarling. I could watch him from my hiding spot. He was a massive shadow moving through the trees. Suddenly he stopped, his ears twitching. I heard the rustle of leaves and I saw a group of hikers coming up the trail. My heart sank. They were laughing, completely unaware of the danger. The creature that was my brother Tom's ears perked up, and he turned toward them. I knew I had to act fast. I grabbed my flashlight and I started flashing it, trying to get the hikers' attention without drawing Tom's. It worked. They saw the light, and they turned back the way they came. I don't think they understood what I was doing, but I know I freaked them out. I kept flashing the light at them until I was sure they were gone. Tom was agitated, pacing back and forth, but he didn't follow them, and he still didn't notice me. When he finally calmed down, he wandered off deep into the woods, and there was nothing more I could do. The next morning I found him again, exhausted and confused. He didn't remember chasing the hikers, but he was horrified when I told him about it. We didn't expect hiking at night. We knew we had to be more careful in the future. So we started scouting for better locations deeper in the forest, away from trails and away from people. We kept up this routine successfully for another few months, but it was taking a toll. Tom was getting more withdrawn, scared of what he might do next. I could see the guilt and shame eating him alive. I tried to stay strong for him, but it was hard. I was exhausted too, working during the day and keeping watch at night. We were both falling apart. We decided to try something different, moving off the grid entirely. We'd go deep into the woods, build a cabin, and live like survivalists away from the human world. It seemed crazy, but what else could we do? We didn't have much money, but we sure did have training and survival skills. We spent weeks preparing, gathering supplies, and planning our escape. We found a spot about 20 miles from the nearest town, deep in the forest. It was perfect. Isolated, quiet, and far from any trails. We started building a cabin using the skills we learned in the military. It wasn't much, but it was a start. On the first night after we finished, the full moon rose. Tom decided to spend the night in the woods, away from the cabin, to avoid wrecking it during his transformation. I stayed close by, keeping watch from a distance. As the moon rose, he changed, the now familiar horror of the transformation gripping me. That night I saw him get surrounded by wolves, real wolves. I wanted to intervene, but I wasn't sure what to do. He tried to scare them off, but it didn't work. It was a brutal fight, with Tom growling and baring his teeth, swiping at the wolves with his claws. The wolves did eventually back off, sensing that they were no match for him. Tom, panting and weary, wandered off into the trees. The sight was terrifying, but I couldn't help feeling a strange sense of awe. Even in his monstrous form, he was still my brother, still fighting to control himself. Despite our isolation, accidents still happen. One day we had to go into town for supplies. It was still a few days before the full moon, but we needed food and fuel. We were in a grocery store parking lot when it happened. Tom clutched his chest, eyes wide with panic. I realized the change was happening earlier than expected. I tried to get him into the truck, but he started to change there in the middle of the lot. People screamed. Tom's body twisted and grew. I shouted at him to get in the back seat, and miraculously he did. I drove off, tires screeching. My heart was pounding as I drove out of town, praying we wouldn't get stopped. I had to abandon the truck a few miles out and let him out. He ran off into the woods, and I headed back to the cabin alone. We're ready to spend the rest of our lives out here in the woods, but we would like to find a solution to this problem so that we can rejoin humanity. Is there a cure for lycanthropy? If anyone out there knows, please let me know. Tom doesn't know how this happened to him, or if he does, he won't tell me. Now his condition is getting worse, and I don't know how much longer we can keep this up. Plumbing the Dogman depths. Dear Scary Stories NYC, this all started about 5 years ago when I started running my small plumbing business. I'm going to call my friend Sam, but that's not his real name. Back then I was just looking for some help, someone to handle the grunt work, so I could take on some more jobs. I didn't expect that hiring Sam would lead to something like this. I put up a sign in the local hardware store and I ran a couple of ads online. Sam was the first qualified plumber to respond. He showed up at my shop one morning, looking eager but a bit rough around the edges. He was tall and wiry, with a mop of curly brown hair and bright blue eyes that seemed to light up when he talked about fixing things. We got to chatting, and I found out he'd been doing odd jobs here and there, but no steady work. He'd lost his parents young and had been on his own since he was a teenager. We started to work together, and it didn't take long for us to hit it off. Sam was quick to learn and had a knack for the work. More than that, he was good company. We would chat about everything. Sports, movies, even politics sometimes, but rarely. We'd grab beers after work and swap stories. I found out he was a bit of a wanderer, never really staying in one place for too long before this job, but he was trying to settle down. I don't have much family and he doesn't have any, so I guess that's why we bonded so quickly. After a few months, we weren't just co-workers. We were pretty much best friends. We could rely on each other for anything. If I needed a hand moving something heavy or fixing my car, Sam was there. And if he needed a place to crash or someone to talk to, my door was always open. I started calling him Cuz for cousin, and he did the same with me. It felt good to have someone like that in my life. But then things started to change. Sam began showing up late for work, looking like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes would be bloodshot, and he'd be jittery, like he was on edge all the time. At first I thought he was just partying too hard or dealing with some personal issues. I didn't push him too hard about it because he was still doing his job, and we all have rough patches, right? One night, after a particularly long day, We were packing up the tools and I noticed he had some nasty scratches on his arms. I asked him about it and he just shrugged it off, saying he'd gotten into a scuffle with a stray dog. It didn't sit right with me, but I let it go. A few days later, we were on a job fixing a busted pipe in an old house. Sam was supposed to meet me there at 8 a.m., but he didn't show up till noon. He looked worse than ever, with dark circles under his eyes, and his clothes all rumpled and dirty. I was about to give him a piece of my mind, but he looked so miserable that I couldn't bring myself to do it. We got to work and then he was his usual self, chatting away. However, there was this nervous edge to him. Then came the night that changed everything. It was a full moon, and we were working late on a big job that had to be done by the morning. We were fixing a water heater in the basement of a commercial building, and it was just the two of us there. Around 11 p.m., Sam started acting really strange. He was sweating and breathing heavily, and he kept glancing at the door like he wanted to bolt. I asked him if he was okay, and he just muttered something about feeling sick. I told him to sit down and take a break, but he shook his head and kept working. Suddenly he doubled over, clutching his stomach and groaning. I ran over to him thinking he was having a seizure. His whole body started to shake, and he fell to the ground screaming. I had no idea what was happening. I tried to hold him still, but he was thrashing around like a wild animal. I screamed as his skin started to ripple and stretch. I could hear his bones popping. Fur sprouted from his arms and from his face, and his hands twisted into claws. His face pushed out into a snout, and his eyes changed to glowing white-yellow orbs. I watched in horror as my best friend turned into a monster right in front of me. When it was over, Sam, or what used to be Sam, was a massive snarling beast. His clothes were shredded, hanging off of him in tatters. He threw his head back and let out a howl that echoed through the basement, scaring the bejesus out of me. I was frozen, too scared to move. The werewolf, my best friend Werewolf, started sniffing the air, and then turned his gaze on me. I could see a flash of recognition in his eyes, but it was clouded by something primal, something terrifying. He growled, and I thought he was going to attack. I backed away slowly, trying to keep my movements calm and steady. Just then, a noise from the stairs, a thud, maybe a falling tool, caught his attention. He snarled, turned, and bounded up the stairs, leaving me shaking in the basement. Well, I couldn't sleep that night. I just sat in my truck outside the building with a weapon on my lap, waiting for the morning. When the sun came up, I went back in and I found Sam huddled in a corner, nearly naked, covered in filth. He was human again, but he looked broken, like he'd been through hell. I wrapped him in my jacket and got him out to the truck. When he woke up the next day, he didn't remember all this stuff. I told him what I had seen, and he just stared at me. He didn't want to believe it, but he couldn't deny the evidence. We spent hours talking, trying to figure out what to do. Sam was scared that he might hurt someone next time, and I was scared that he might hurt himself. We started planning. Sam's condition seemed to be tied to the full moon, so we marked the dates down, and we would drive away from town when the full moon was coming. Well, we tried out our plan, and I admit it didn't go well at first. We drove out to an abandoned farm about 10 miles from town. The place was a mess. Old barns falling apart, fields overgrown with weeds. It seemed perfect for us, though. Far enough from civilization that hopefully no one would stumble across us. As the night came on, Sam started to change. I watched from a distance, heart pounding, as his body twisted and grew. His screams turned into growls, and then he was the werewolf again, roaming the fields, sniffing and snarling. I stayed hidden in a hayloft in an old barn, keeping an eye on him. Suddenly I heard a noise, a car engine getting closer. I ran to the edge of the field and I saw a couple of teenagers driving up, probably looking for a place to hang out and neck. My heart sank. They had no idea the danger they were walking into. I looked over and I saw Sam starting to move toward them. I grabbed my flashlight and started flashing it, trying to get the teen's attention without drawing Sam's. It didn't work, so I ran out on the road in front of their car, and they turned around, afraid of me like I was a crazy person. As I watched them speed off, I breathed a sigh of relief, until I noticed Sam was agitated, pacing back and forth, and looking at me. I stood perfectly still, making sure not to make eye contact, and watched him in my peripheral vision. Eventually he grew bored of me and wandered deeper into the fields. The next morning I found him again, exhausted and confused. We both knew we had to be more careful. We started looking for better locations, deeper into the country, away from any roads or trails at all. We found a more remote spot, a patch of woods about 15 miles out. It was dense and hard to navigate, but perfect for what we needed. We set up a small camp, just a tent and some supplies. On the next full moon, Sam decided to spend the night in the woods, away from our camp, to avoid wrecking it during his transformation. I climbed a tree so I could keep watch from a distance. That night, I saw him encounter a bear. It was a brutal fight, with Sam growling and baring his teeth, swiping at the bear with his claws. And it was the bear who backed off, sensing he was no match for Sam in his new form. Despite all our precautions, accidents still happened. We were committed to camping every month around the full moon as our new lifestyle. I owe him that much at least. I keep hoping I'll find a way to help Sam, but I really don't even know where to start. And we're running out of places to go. If anyone out there knows a way to cure werewolfism, please let me know. The place we're living in now is safer, but we still do have to go into town, and I'm scared of what might happen if we get caught. Sam's condition continues to worsen and worsen, and I don't know how much longer we can keep plumbing the Dogman depths. I'm telling the truth, and I ain't lying. This episode made possible by Brian. Please join me in welcoming Brian Short, our newest channel member. Brian gets to hear our secret, uncensored, members-only stories, and so can you. If you'd like to find out more, listen to our international TV spokesmongrel, Henry Lee Dogman. Hank. Thanks, Biggie, and thanks to all of you for watching this far. If you liked it, please click like. If you'd like to see more of our work, please subscribe. And also click that bell icon if you'd like to be notified when we put out a new episode. To become an executive producer, you can donate to us through the thanks button under each of our videos or through our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. To receive cool perks like secret uncensored Dogman episodes far too wild to ever run on this channel, you can become a YouTube channel member by clicking the join button, or join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Joining either at the $3 a month level or above gets you access to our over 25 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. Do you have a scary story about Dogman or some other kind of high strangeness that happened to you? Let us know by emailing us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or by leaving us a voicemail message at 804-LA-SCARY. You may need to call back on that one. It cuts off after, I think, 3 minutes. And if you don't want to do any of that stuff, thank you for simply watching to the end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.